Welcome to the Tuesday, April 16th, 2024 meeting of the Carrboro Town Council. This meeting is a work session. There will be no public comment and no formal action taken by the Town Council. Councilmember Posada is not able to be with us this evening due to a family matter. Could I get a motion to excuse Councilmember Posada?
So moved.
Second.
Right, it's been moved and properly seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you so much. Town Manager Parker.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good evening, council members. Tonight we have a council work session on our FY 24-25 budget. The purpose of this session is to provide council an update to the 24-25 FY budget development, recommended strategies and actions related to council priorities outlined in the council retreat, explain budget considerations for FY 24-25, and to seek council direction in preparation for May's budget work session next month. And we have our Finance Director, Brett Green, here to present.
All right, thank you, Marie. Good evening, Madam Mayor, council members. Appreciate your time this evening as we iterate towards the adoption of our fiscal year 25 budget. I'm gonna open this up. We do have a presentation that y'all have essentially completed. There were some slight tweaks, nothing to the data, but just some language and some edits to guide the conversation. Certainly feel free to interject whenever. This is just, again, I think the goal of tonight is to be sure as staff is preparing their budgets and we're aggregating that information for you all to formally go line by line and see the numbers and the balancing act that is the budget process to ensure that the council objectives and priorities are worked through that process, identify some themes and some challenges the town and every other town in the nation is facing. And again, just an opportunity for, we felt that this was an open spot on the calendar and a chance to get in front of the budget instead of trying to put everything and package it all together in one work session like last year.
I was up to drive. I didn't know if you had problems getting to it.
Not yet, Lamar. Give me an hour.
Give me an hour.
So again, it's about a 20-slide deck. It's open-ended intentionally. There are not many numbers intentionally at this point. Again, we're going to build off the model work session from last month, and I appreciate allowing our department to monopolize 3 work sessions in a row as we get to the July 1st adoption date. So we're going to start kind of at a high level as you see in your packet and work into the actual budget process for the town of Carrboro. I will take the opportunity to give our finance group an update and some accolades because, as you'll see in the couple slides, we feel like we are well prepared for the first time in a bit to accomplish and support the other departments of the town. Then we'll move on to some general macroeconomic conditions, which directly and indirectly influence our decision-making and recommendations to you all before we go forward with a formal adoption. We'll get into the specifics of our budgeting process, the timeline, where we are from now until July 1, which is the last date for adoption for next fiscal year. We'll mention subjectively some strategies for next year as we go through, more formal audit, capital update, and how to get in front a little bit more, some ideas for next budget year. And then lastly, and probably where we'll focus the most time, is making sure that what we're working on is in line with the strategies, objectives, priorities in the short term and the long term of you all as council. So as of 3 weeks ago, the finance department is full and we will not be putting forth any formal request for additional staffing for next fiscal year. That is a foreshadowing of a study that is going to be kicked off in terms of the staff, or has already been kicked off for staffing. We have tried to rebuild or build trust within the town and the staff and the department heads and other leaders within the staff, and open up our doors as much as we can. Adopt open budget office hours, to piggyback off the school government, to allow folks to drop in, express concerns, ask questions, learn about what a budget means, and so. Certain folks have taken advantage of that already. We'll continue to have those. The most important thing is that we're available as needed whenever, and that's the message we're trying to dictate to the other staff and other departments. We're developing goals, deliverables, expectations, transparency, support are our main two processes and procedures based on former staff and former outside consultants that are very good recommendations we're looking to finally incorporate. Formalize. You'll see later that we're going to revisit some policies within the town, make recommendations for council approval in the coming months. But the near-term objective is getting this fiscal year 2025 budget adopted. Some of the duties, just to outline, I'm sure council is well aware, but the finance department does take on many tasks that might not be always intuitive. Certainly stewards of fiscal policy and managing the town's money, but we also, are you're welcome when you come into town hall. We also, facilitate and negotiate insurance on the property casualty and vehicle, not on the healthcare. We don't step on Julie's feet. We do all the check runs, we do all the bank reconciliations and formal accounting and financial practices, obviously. But the group is dynamic. The group is eager to support. We're eager to help as we can to source other revenue. Our last position filled was a grant manager, as council is well aware. Recommendations perhaps will be coming on how we allocate that role as ARPA funding goes off into the sunset, and opportunities for diversified revenue strategies to support the town and its initiatives. But again, a staff of 8 now. Everyone, we feel we are now in a position to take responsibility, segregate duties, have overlapping roles. We have a lot of seasoned municipal folks in seats at the table. We have a few new ones to the town, but all are competent, all are willing to learn, all are working hard to achieve objectives. So this is just a template for what council will see in the adopted budget and the budget book for each department. But this is where the finance group stands currently. So shifting away from our selfish pitch of the finance group, I just wanted to take the opportunity to give some quick oversight for where the town of Carrboro stands in very quick relation to other municipalities within North Carolina. There are over 550 municipalities ranging in size from I believe it's under 200 to Charlotte. At 21,000 plus, we're probably in that median in terms of size. The oldest town was incorporated was Bath in the early 1700s. And then most recently, our friends up 85 north of Durham, across the lake in Butner, decided to secede from the state in 2007 and form their own municipality. The biggest red flag for a town finance department is ending up on this UAL, which is Unit Assistance List. And this is when the North Carolina League of Municipalities steps in and says that the finance department is not fulfilling its tasks, whether they suspect foul play, not often, or just not able to perform the duties necessary as outlined by state statutes. Surprisingly, that's over 150 municipalities across the state. I sat next to folks recently from the eastern part of the state, and they are not all small municipalities. Some are well known and have been and resided on that list for some time. And what that means to be on that list is that you're very limited in your capacity to issue debt, if at all able to. So one source of revenue is basically curtailed. The league is heavily involved with the day-to-day operations, rightfully so, to hopefully right the ship for those municipalities and get them more on the straight and narrow. Some of the municipalities on that list are very small and perhaps a finance department of one. So it is literally impossible to segregate financial duties within that department. But the recommendation, if one was in that such situation, would be to lean on other departments, council members, or someone as a backup. Once you get on that list, it is not easy to get off that list. And the best takeaway from this slide is the town of Carrboro is nowhere near being considered inclusion on that list. But again, just some perspective and interesting fun facts that I found in my first 3 months of navigating North Carolina municipal finance. So moving along, again, you see these graphics in your printouts, and I feel it's always relevant whenever I do a budget process to look at the macroeconomic climate, what's going on in the world, how can these outside considerations impact internal planning. The top left there is one of the guiding lights for all municipalities, all organizations, all groups. Is the equity lens. I believe the town of Carrboro does a very, very, very good and proactive job incorporating that into the budget process, in so much as we require each department to develop a narrative around race and equity with their budget submission. So that's not new this year. That's been included in prior budget books. And you'll see a slide with some links to our list of publicly available documents in your packet. If you're curious about any departments and how they've responded to that, that task and that directive and that priority in prior years. I don't remember where I saw that graphic first, but it was, for me, it stuck with me for a difference and something that I could relate to, even my children, on what the difference is between equality and equity and how we strive for equity and equitable practices, throughout the web of the town of Carrboro. Top right, obviously, not drawing any conclusions, but it's an election year. So what does that mean? It means uncertainty. It means some risk that's not, every 3 out of 4 years isn't there. So it's just a consideration. We don't know where that's going to go and what that's going to mean, but it's going to happen. So we want to be prepared for that. The bottom left is kind of this touches a little bit on Laura's world, but I think it is relevant for a lot of reasons. But the two that are most apparent, the bottom left shows the number of events that trigger billion-dollar claims, I believe is the title. And that's a two-faceted approach. The first being increased valuation of property, of land, of things, which bifurcates every facet of our budgeting consideration right now. Everything's expensive, but it's also the number of those events, 4 to 5 times an annual event that it was 25 years ago. So geographically, the town of Carrboro is seemingly well protected from most of those environmental disasters, but things like Florence happen and come and dump a foot of rain over 4 days. So you will see more formally next month how some of this bleeds into some emergency response preparedness that the town is considering undertaking. But it is, again, just another fact that these events are out there and they're not to be ignored. And then lastly, this probably 3 years ago would have been the top left, but now it's the bottom right of slide 1 of 2, so still important. But we see inflation, although we're still in an inflationary environment, curtailing somewhat. And I hesitate to put too much emphasis on the somewhat, but we're not seeing 11%, we're not seeing 9%, we're not seeing 7% that we saw last, just December 31st, 2022. We're seeing 3%. Almost back to a normal. 2% is considered normal. So what that means I'll jump to the bottom left here, is what the Federal Reserve would do. So the bottom left is a snippet of all the Federal Reserve rate increases or decreases, no decreases on here, right now that have occurred recently. So this is effectively the rate at which banks can borrow amongst themselves, which directly translates to credit cards, mortgages, refinances, car loans, any debt, including municipal debt. So it's still expensive. There are no negatives on that chart. It's probably easier to read in the packet, but just so the whoever is viewing this can see what is highlighted here are 4 consecutive, not 4 months, but over a 6-month period, 4 consecutive 75 basis point increases. In the past 30 years, there have been 2 75 basis point increases. So to see 4 in 6 months is unprecedented. This was a result of responding to the pandemic, as you can tell by the dates of November 2nd, June 16th, 2022 through November of 2022. And it just means borrowing got very expensive very quickly. There was an immediate 100 basis point decrease when the pandemic hit in April of 2020, but then followed by multiple and consistent increases, of which we've seen no cut yet, although the Federal Reserve is alluding to the potential of perhaps peeling back at 25 basis points a clip. Again, to put this in perspective, the only time there's ever been more than a 75 basis point increase in one Federal Reserve decision in the history of the Federal Reserve, so over a century, was in 1994 after the Gulf War. So scary inflationary times that we think are kind of behind us, but it is going to be a trend for the budgeting process for town of Carrboro in fiscal year 2025 as we try to respond to this environment and play a little bit of catch up. The top left just shows some numbers that we thought were good to present to the group. We see growth in terms of measured by GDP, gross domestic product, declining slightly. All the stats in the Southeast are more promising than the national statistics by about 0.5%, which is encouraging. As the growth declines, the unemployment rate tends to go up. Again, North Carolina and likely, although I don't have the data to support it, but hyper locally is likely much lower than that 4.7% shown nationally. But when growth goes down, unemployment tends to go up, which again, all these things are interrelated. And eventually would drive that bottom left table down to start seeing some rate cuts potentially. And then lastly, I don't know how this directly relates, but I did think it was important because I saw a billboard in downtown Atlanta recently that showed the per capita debt for U.S. citizens. And I polled the department heads at our budget retreat internally, and they gave some numbers, and I won't put council on the spot and ask anyone, but it's over $100,000 a person. So my little family of 5 is already $500,000 in debt on the federal level. So it's a big number, and it's scary. And once you hit an exponential curve, you can look at Japan in the 90s, you can look at countless other, you can look at Greece, you can look at Brazil, you can look at multiple nations across the world over the span of recent history. It's hard to come down off that exponential growth pattern. So that's my economics lesson, and then we'll shift into the more granular, but not getting too granular because we're reserving that for next month. So the good news is that's 2 of the 4 bullets on the agenda. Again, I think the bulk of the conversation will be on the latter half, but I appreciate council affording me the time to walk through that, as I do think it is important. So this is something that the finance group put before the town leaders in our budget retreat, because we often hear that it's budget season, and even at trainings with finance folks within North Carolina and municipalities, like, we're in budget season. What does it mean? What do we have to do? And why is it important? And who does it go to? And who sees it? And what are the impacts? And the answer is yes, anyone can see it. That's a different lens from a previous life of mine where not many people could see all of it, but now everyone can see it, and that's the goal. The goal is to be very transparent with the residents, with council, with the staff, with anyone in the world that wants to go to the Town of Carrboro website and look at our budget, which makes us accountable. And for me and our group's goal is what triggers our seeking buy-in from other department heads and knowing that it's their budget, it's their guidance, it's their document. So what are some of the guardrails that the finance department has recommended to outline are over on the right? And again, the transparency is probably the predominant theme for both the process and the final document in the budget book. It is I'll skip down to the third bullet. It's still a guess. We think it's a very good guess. And I haven't put KPIs around ranges, which is something I like to do, but we'll get there. But we think it's a very informed and educated guess. There's, as you'll see later in the packet, there isn't a whole lot of variability on the revenue side of the equation. So it becomes a harder exercise to prioritize on the expenses. Because as council knows better than I, we are statutorily required to produce a balanced budget every year. The last bullet also, again, we don't have to go word by word. Council's already reviewed the documents, is we want to continue to emphasize the theme of flexibility. We don't want to say it's a buzzword as a living document, but we want it to be adaptable and be able to react to externalities that happen in the world that we did not predict in producing the budget, because this budget guides us for 12 to 12 and a half months until we can adopt next year's budget. So it's somewhat short term, but a lot can happen in 12 months. And we're formulating the budget now, so maybe it's 15 months. And no one predicted the pandemic. So those are the things that we're trying to work through as we have the departments develop the budgeting process. I almost led with this slide because this is probably most relevant. So this year, we're right in the middle of budget. For better or for worse, this is where we are. Next year, we have goals that we'll present to council after the summer. We'll have a nice pie chart that shows the year and where we think things will land, but this is where we are today. We're halfway through. We are going through the first submission of budget materials has been presented to the finance department and is currently undergoing review, department by department. We're in constant discussions with the town manager and town manager's office, as well as department heads and other staff leaders, until we formally present that to council. We have the opportunity for another budget work session in May. We didn't feel like that would be the most effective use of time to try to get all this into one work session, which is why we're here tonight, as previously stated. So again, thank you. We started in early February. Our goal was to start that earlier, next fiscal year, but that's when we started this time. We do have a couple things to point out on what's remaining, just statutorily, and just to reinforce, more so for the public's sake than for council's sake. But we will recommend a budget. We will put that budget on display publicly. That budget has to sit publicly on display, whether that's on a website, whether that's hard copies here in town hall, whether that's a combination of the two, or any other mechanism for public viewing. It has to sit and be reviewed, if wanted, for 10 calendar days. Not 10 business days, 10 calendar days. So that's the only real critical path for timeline of budget adoption. We have to give notice for a public hearing. We have to have a public hearing. The statutes for the state of North Carolina allow for council to adopt budget the same day as a public hearing. We did not recommend that in this outline to allow residents or whomever time to absorb. ask questions, be involved in the process. So as you can see, our goal is to be substantially complete within the next 6 weeks, and we want to afford ourselves anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks at the end of fiscal year 2024 for tweaks, considerations, nuances before formal adoption. So we don't want to press up to July 1, 2024, which is a Monday. We would like to be adopted well before that and move on to other town interests beyond the budget. And here's where we're starting to get specific. So this was our attempt of writing up the takeaways from the council retreat earlier this calendar year. And again, these specifically the short-term objectives, hopefully council will see that staff has worked very hard to incorporate those objectives into their budget planning for next fiscal year. I do believe collectively a lot of work has been done in starting to incorporate the long-term goals and initiatives into the workflow. I'll start with that because it's a bit easier. So if you look at the third bullet under long-term priority with the focus on subsidization of affordable housing, council will see a recommendation in the coming weeks directly related to that through ARPA funding. On that theme, ARPA funding has already been allocated towards the implementation of the Community Safety Task Force, a fair amount of money. The council had unanimously approved the language access plan. So we are making progress on the long-term initiatives. But the focus, candidly, for next year's budget has been on the short term and how to incorporate those priorities within the budget, knowing that there are lots of levers that are trying to be pulled and not everyone can be funded fully. Again, the theme, and I tweaked this a little from your packet just to try to make it less growth is slow, expenses are high, just to say we just have to step back and realize what service levels we're trying to provide to the town, to the residents, and how we can effectively support those services, improve if possible, but at the very least maintain the standard the town is accustomed to. And what are staff's recommendations to council to fulfill those needs to be determined. But again, laying out the framework, seeing where we stand, and then how do we bridge the gap, if any exists. Again, just for public and anyone viewing online, 2 links that are very easy to navigate. Town of Carrboro, department, I think it's under government, finance. A list of documents will populate. You'll see the historical budget books, historical capital improvement programs, historical audit findings. So those are links to those items. Within the adopted budget hyperlink on the town website are about 14 to 17 hyperlinks within each fiscal year. One of those is a by department line item budget, which one could reference for prior years publicly. And then lastly, the challenges and the hard work that all the town staff has put forth has been incorporating these budget considerations, which is an overlap of the council identified priorities, but it is cause for consideration, as lack of a better term. It's a balancing act. It's a prioritization exercise. It's where do we want to focus our dollars in the next 15 months? So in the packet, I did provide a revenue trend, because like I said, that's the first piece of the puzzle that we identified for council. I think the biggest takeaway here for those council members that were involved with prior years is that we're being a little more conservative on the revenue forecast based on history. So historically, from my perspective, we had shown the line item 1, which accounts for over 50% of the revenue for a given fiscal year, forecasted to grow at a 3% rate. Over the past 4 years since the last revaluation, which is a subject that was a seed to plant for next year's meeting that we can discuss further. It will not impact next year's budget, but it's something on the horizon to consider, as we talked about in the planning and model work session. We have never, as a town, in the last 4 years, we have not achieved a 1.5% growth on that line item. So to forecast a 3% didn't seem prudent and would have immediately potentially put us slightly behind the 8 ball. In terms of correlating the objectives to the costs, the 3% versus 1.5% isn't gonna, that it is a significant dollar amount, but it's not gonna balance the equation on its own regardless. You can see the 1.5% is just under $250,000. Again, significant, but 3%, 1.5%, still not a huge dollar amount for a $30 million operating budget. Sales taxes just generally across the state, we've seen skyrocket during COVID, weirdly. I don't know of anyone that thought that would happen, but it did. I have my own personal theories, but some of the neat adaptations that businesses took on and the ability to provide 5 meals takeout for the week for a family instead of having a family of 5 come in for one time every 3 weeks, right? I mean, that weirdly increased revenue for certain retailers. There was a heavy increase in online sales tax revenue collection. Again, using food, not that that's all my family thinks about, but Omaha Steaks versus Clyde's, not going to Harris Teeter, but doing online ordering through national retailers or local if available. Unfortunately, the state has seen that start to slow. So it's still our highest growth of 2.5% that we're forecasting for next fiscal year. But again, there are other reasons why that might have slowed, but we do think that it's a realistic number. It's higher than the natural organic growth of the ad valorem taxes, but we don't think we'll see the 7, 8, 12% sales tax revenue increase. All the other line items are up for discussion, up for consideration. We don't see them moving the needle for next fiscal year. They are certainly a focus and a goal of mine and the finance department to review. Specifically, as you'll see in a later slide, working with other departments to go through and do just a line-by-line look at our fee schedule. Is it appropriate? How does it align with neighbors? Is it disincentivizing? So we heard a webinar, my group, about municipalities that had a pet fee. So the pet fee was charged and collected at the time of the rabies vaccination for the pet. So folks that didn't want to pay the pet fee to that municipality ended up avoiding getting the rabies shot for the pet. So do you want potentially unvaccinated, we don't use that term lightly anymore, but do we want pets without a rabies vaccination around the community instead of collecting a nominal charge? I don't know the answer, but it was an interesting perspective. So we have about 174 other fees in our fee schedule, so it's due for review. The other point here, which maybe I can proactively address some questions, is that last line item for fund balance appropriated. So this is where it's not a we would not, as staff and finance, recommend this as a continuing process. This is basically to fund identified expenses and programmed expenses for a fiscal year out of the fund balance reserve. We do feel in the initial development of next year's fiscal year budget, it would be appropriate for next fiscal year to consider this as a funding option based on the level of that reserve and the needs of the town that we've identified as staff. And I think we touched on that during the last work session, is where the town is ranging. The unassigned fund balance as a percent of the expenditures has been identified by previous council as being 22.5% to 35%. Given the day, the week, the month, we see the town of Carrboro hovering 42 to 52% right now. So each percent represents about $250,000. So that represents potentially getting back towards the high end of that reserve range, targeting the 40 to 42% in a one-year iteration. Because we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. As we saw in the last work session, that can waterfall into future years. And once you go down that path, it's hard to reverse. But again, potentially a recommendation for next year's fiscal year budget. And we'll have a more formal, this is the most number-heavy slide out there for anyone viewing. But we thought it was important to just show the dependence on the town on the ad valorem taxes, the significance of the sales tax in developing the budget, and then what else happens. So this is what else happens and what else we're considering, and the left side of the equation. And this is, the numbers slide is followed by the wordy slide. So again, more so for council to read through, hopefully prior to, if not now, what our goals are for next year. So from July 1, 2024 through June 30, 2025, the biggest takeaway that staff received from the council retreat was investment in staffing, retention, and recruitment. So we have a three-pillar approach to that. We want to directly influence our existing staff with that first bullet point and bring them back to some neighboring levels that we've seen and observed and analyzed. And again, that number on its own stands out. But and we're happy to provide this information, going back through neighboring municipalities and other peers over the past, since COVID, really fiscal year 21, fiscal year 22, the town of Carrboro has done a great investment in the staff. Others have done more. So we view this as a one-time adjustment to get back to competitiveness with existing staff. That's pillar one. Pillar two is a substantial investment through a staffing study to recognize the workload of all the departments and take a very, very granular, in-depth, costly investment in where the town needs to be right size in terms of staffing levels and positions. So that is underway. That we plan to wrap up in the fall. We have incorporated 10 positions into the budget across departments as a placeholder, effective January 1 of 2025. Positions are not cheap, as council is well aware. The 10 additional positions represents 6-7% increase in staffing levels. Again, not insignificant, but we feel an appropriate first step without knowing what that study will come back with. So we felt it prudent to put a somewhat large number. I know that's very simple sounding, but some significant placeholder into next year's numbers, knowing that it could go up and it might go down, but it could go up. So that's prong two. And then lastly, the town rightfully undertook a compensation study, very in-depth and thoughtful in fiscal year 2022. The world has turned a few times, and that is due for a refresher in terms of some peer analysis and updating the pay scale. It won't be as heavy an investment nor as heavy as a time commitment for staff and facilitating, but we do feel it does incorporate the goals of council to have that third-party examination on the current pay scale. So we plan to start that as early as July, maybe started in August, kind of aligning with the end of the staffing study, so we get some, we get some overlap there and some connectivity. So that addresses council objective 1 in terms of the staff development and staff goals. Public transportation was not on the council objectives, but it's our single most expensive line item, aside from personnel. So as council is aware, and public is aware, the blue buses and other forms of transport that we are collectively involved with are an economies of scale for the residents of Carrboro and attract residents to come here that may otherwise consider other locations. We are about a 9% partner. The university is the majority of the investment. They are over 60%, and then the town of Chapel Hill and Carrboro, and that's based on population between the municipalities. That number is $2.2 million. If you remember back to January and March, that was this line item and this transportation consideration was a trigger for a budget violation in fiscal year 2022 that we had to respond to. The town did everything it needed to appropriately, but again, that's just another point of reference for the importance of this. It stands on its own in the budget. It's its own, effectively its own department. It's its own. There's no other ins and outs in this contract. It's set forth in June of each year for the next calendar year with a little bit of leeway for adjustments up or down. So we had initially considered a 3 to 5% increase on that $2.2 million, which doing the math gets you to $2.4 million. The partnership leaders had come back with us at about a 2.8 number, which represents about a 22% increase. And that is curtailed back slightly in the past couple weeks to 18%. So now in our preliminary budget, we're placeholding $2.7 million instead of 2.2. So a $500,000 year-over-year increase to maintain our partnership within this public transportation agreement. But I can't quantify it tonight. But if there are questions or anything around that, we are happy to develop answers. We do feel as a town there is a return on investment in the public transportation, certainly, and we can make an attempt to quantify some of those numbers because again, for a finance group, when you see that number that represents almost 10% of your annual budget, you're like, wow, okay. So
is it still appropriate for us to jump in at any time?
It is.
I'm going to jump in at this time. I think, I am personally pretty favorably disposed to that expense, and I think it's pretty likely that it will align with our priorities. But I think it would be important in our next work session to get a sense from the partnership, particularly in response to the restoration of service that has decreased in Carrboro, particularly since the start of the pandemic. We have suffered some line losses that other partners have not. And I think, or at least frequency within service of a couple lines, is my understanding. And I would love to just get a sense of the gaps from pre-pandemic levels in relation to that service or in that investment, and just generally more detail on that investment, which again, I expect to continue to view very favorably. Personally.
Yeah, so Brett, the contracts are laid out you said in June?
Correct.
And so 2024, 25, right? We're still going to base it on population? Or are we going to ask to look at potentially service in terms of what we pay? And I raise that because Chapel Hill, 15501 Fordham Boulevard and Caraway Village are exploding in population, and and service is an issue in Carrboro. So at what point will we be paying for the percentage of service we receive?
So off the top of my head, I don't know the answer, but we can work with our partners and ask that and come back, if not earlier, by the next work session and do a deeper dive into the contract. But yes, I appreciate that consideration of 15501, traversing it daily.
Mary, you look like you add something. Do you have something to add?
No, Brett said it. It's definitely something we can talk to our partners about.
And that's maybe one of the ways we can look at some of the data. Because I don't know what the current projection, the difference between Chapel Hill's population a year ago to what it will be this next year.
Sure. Okay. Next on the list is the rewrite of the land use ordinance. So the director of planning is well ahead of this, and it is not a short process, but it is a substantial investment relative to other needs that we have incorporated in our initial budget considerations. We plan to act on moving that, whatever that means, as quickly as possible. I don't know, and council likely knows better than I, how long it takes for that to translate potentially into garnering different diversification of revenue streams. But the first step is obviously the rewrite, and was well heard by staff and put on the list. There's only 5 bullets, right? So that's a heavy investment that we're planning to pursue next fiscal year.
Am
Councilmember,
I? We'll see if I can not cough.
if you can get it out.
I'll try. Brett, similar, you had some guidance for us around things like the staffing study and the compensation study about planned start dates. Any cues for us around dates related to the land use ordinance rewrite? When that investment may start in the fiscal year?
Yes, I appreciate the question. Immediately is the start. The end, I think, it is the harder one to conceptualize, but knowing that it could be over a year, for the objectives that we've incorporated in our planning, to have outside folks doing the legwork on this, and with back and forth with appropriate staff. We do not see this being completed in August, being completed in October, being completed in January, but we need to start it in July.
And so that means that we will be start to look for consultants within the next fiscal year. Is that what you're saying when you say immediately?
That is my understanding, yes.
Check.
I can add a little bit more
ahead.
detail
Go
to
ahead,
that. I know a scope is already underway to be developed. We've also consulted with some other municipalities to get some costs and some peer information. So we are doing the
Already
legwork.
started.
Mhm.
Yep. Thank you.
The next 2 bullets are also heavy in terms of budget preparation and consideration for council and for staff to support. As a group, we reviewed the last couple year budget work sessions and noticed the amount of time spent on these appropriately so, and have some recommendations, again preliminary, for how we go about supporting the community through these channels. Independent of that previous slide, which mentioned the presentation to the investment of the ARPA funds that the council will see coming shortly. But as an operating budget consideration, we felt it was appropriate to maybe course correct slightly instead of analyzing every ask every month, every hour, every quarter, every organization, then having staff score those, present those, and council approve those. Perhaps there's a more effective, more efficient way to get the needs to the community equitably, quicker, efficiently. So as you see, we've identified the three of the larger players that have popped up historically within the budget process. Community Home Trust, I don't mean to, group Raleigh with Charlotte or, so I don't want to say these are all the same, and they certainly have different functions within the community locally and however far they reach. But currently we do fund effectively Community Home Trust through a 1.5% dedicated tax that funds the affordable housing fund that is then contractually allocated to that organization. IFC and OCPH are more worrisome from a budgeting perspective, from my limited knowledge in terms of the ask and the annual increases that we've seen come to the town. And independent of who pays for what and how that works, the granular ask is exponential, and the needs of the community are not going down. So instead of reacting to that, we are recommending as staff for council consideration to potentially go to a flat percentage. This is not a town of Carrboro staff incredible realization overnight in a dream. Other municipalities have gone to that. And then certainly the consideration and scoring and all the mechanics with distribution would fall under that allocation annually, but it would just alleviate the piecemeal that leads up to the funding, potentially. So we are proposing that publicly for the first time. We are open to questions and feedback and suggestions, obviously, certainly continuously. I think one of the big considerations we had is that what if in 8 years from now, a new organization comes to town that blows that budget or blows that percentage, but we all develop, council identifies that this is critical to the need, well, then it's a budget amendment. And it's the same process that we're doing now. And it's just a deviation from the percentage, but it's still a consideration and up to council approval and staff to support. So I believe this captures the ability to be not to just have our number publicly known and what we're willing to commit to these organizations instead of really not having any idea what they're going to ask for annually. So that those are some of the, and maybe I didn't say it very well, but those are some of the considerations that we were behind this preliminary recommendation to adopt this human services as a percentage of the operating budget as opposed to individual asks throughout the year. And saving the best for last is way too cliche for a council meeting, but this if I've sometimes asked my staff in roles currently and in prior roles, what keeps you up at night? This keeps me up at night, this last bullet. And it's comprehensive. It's the town is old and the infrastructure is aging. There's the newest buildings. I can still say that until 203 delivers. The newest buildings even need significant consideration for capital upgrades. And the newest building, to my knowledge, would be Fire Station 2. But we're sitting in a building that doesn't have sprinklers. We're sitting in a building that I saw a gentleman carrying a ladder up to the next level. You know, that doesn't really happen in 2024 often. So there are challenges. There are challenges on the capital side. It takes 3 years to get a fire truck. The fleet and the fleet policy is due to be considered. The the town of Carrboro is not behind. We have a good capital improvement plan that's in existence. It is 18 months dated. It is a goal of the finance department to, although not mandated by state statute, it is a governor and another public document that we should put forth, we feel, as a finance group, as costs change so drastically year to year, on the capital side especially. Looking at steel prices, we could probably look at the futures graph for during the construction time of 203 and have palpitations on what that looks like. But construction is one of the drivers on the inflation number. It's usually construction and energy and food. Those are the three big ones for core inflation. And so construction on 203 is and a new building is easy. Retrofitting to a 100-plus-year-old building is not easy. We have, as a town, rightfully so, proactively identified these needs and have had architects, engineers, planners, developers come out and take looks at the infrastructure. Those are due for an update. The council had allocated $1 million to town hall last year. We have invested $155,000 in security upgrades, necessarily so. We feel the rest of that money might be perhaps diligently spent in hiring another consultant, another engineer, another designer, another firm to give us a holistic approach and an action plan. And then once identified, that will lead to further discussions on how to pay for it. And what is the town of Carrboro Council's appetite for funding? Is it debt that's expensive today? Is it tax increases that happens quickly? That's, those are two ideas. We can talk pros and cons of each today, later, anytime. The number that we had most recently, and it's not very recent for town hall, was in the $12 million range. It's likely probably not double that, but closer to double than 12. So probably for this building in the 18 to $22 million range, depending on what council, what the town wants. And that, not to that extent, that's the highest dollar, we think, but Fire Station 1 is old. Public Works is in a floodplain. Century Center is getting a new chiller and new controls, which will help. But there are other things in that building and other skeletons in the closet. So all of the primary public-facing buildings for the town of Carrboro, if appropriate, could use some significant investment. So although the focus of tonight was thematic and what we're considering for next fiscal year, this is on the horizon. And delays likely won't get less expensive. It's just a matter of prioritization on what council wants to address next. We, as staff, are pretty fully attuned to the delivery of 203 right now on the capital side, and what that means. I can tell you what it means on debt services. It means $1.06 million a year. We're triangulating around how much it costs to operate, obviously with the partnership of Orange County, their shared expenses, and the building's beautiful, but we just have to figure out what it means for the finances. And we're wrapping our arms around that. And I think once that building is delivered, the opportunity for exploration on what's next is fair. Obviously, the town has backfilled the role of the capital project manager, so well-staffed in terms of leading these projects and project management. So feel good about that. But again, the last numbers we were navigating are now years old, to almost 4 years old. So a good starting point and good for scope of work, potentially. Maybe that hasn't changed, but the cost certainly has. So as a town and as staff, how do we, what does council need from us in order to recommend where we go next? So it all kinds of keeps me up at night, but that one really does. But then I fall asleep knowing that the town is fiscally sound. We're fiscally responsible. We're not on the UAL. We're not near the UAL. You know, the council has diligently spent funds in the past. We're well positioned for the future. We're in a very good area demographically. The state of North Carolina is governed immaculately compared to other states, even in my brief tenure with a municipality within North Carolina. Our neighbors, I won't even say which way, have been called, the wild, wild west in terms of governance on the state level. What that means for a municipality anywhere in the state, and specifically with Carrboro, is that we, even though debt's expensive, we get the cheapest. So we might save 100 basis points on a 20-year debt issuance compared to, a town in a different state, which is significant if you're thinking of 12, 20, 50, 120, 150 million dollars, which is what that might take to bring everything up to standard today.
What did you say? You said 150 million. What'd you say?
120 to 150.
I started with 12.
I know. That's why I was like, what did you say?
You'll work us up to it.
It's a big number, but I don't. It's not. We don't believe it's pie in the sky.
And the longer we wait, the bigger it gets.
Likely.
Yeah.
I think we do see that even with the construction of 203, from when that plan, with the inception of that until delivery,
Until now.
and how the construction costs varied during the development of that project.
So will we this year start to see some possibilities for our debt load? I know that the portrait is not bad with the 203 project, though it's significant and better, I think, in 2 years, like 2-3 years, than it is now. But I mean, you're going to start to load that up this year for us?
Yes, well, potentially. So the good news and what we presented in the model planning session is that the town of Carrboro, for better or for worse, does not have much debt outside of 203. There are a few sidewalk bonds, that are old, but there's not much out there. Other municipalities have invested in municipal centers and that aren't done yet, because the league had to get involved and they got on the list and they couldn't expand from their original budget, and they've almost bankrupted municipalities, and it's the town's nowhere near any of that. So there is capacity. The capacity is not three numbers. Capacity. We presented it loosely in that work session, and happy to formalize that and bring it back next month in terms of a real analysis on the debt capacity. But there's room, and it's in the $15 to $25 million range to be centric to the peers. If council wanted to be bleeding edge, certainly there's the ability to push that and lever up. I won't recommend one way or the other. It's just is that the route you go at this point? One of the rationalizations for the issuance of debt is to put the burden of cost on future residents and not the full burden for buildings that could last 50 years on the current makeup of the community. So that's fair. Again, back to slide 2, debt's expensive right now. The debt piece might be cheaper, should be cheaper, soon-ish, perhaps.
Soon-ish, perhaps.
That's a good, well answered. Thank you.
Yeah, so Brett, I really appreciate where you have the primary budget considerations, and I'm really glad you put the investments in staffing, retention, recruitment right up front. But I see that there's a correlation between having the facilities and attracting and retaining, recruiting staff. Not only is this building neglected, but apart from some of the things that Manager Parker has done in the last few months. We've got some more security. We've got, it really looks nice in here, but there are really deep things that need to be done. Right, structural things. And I had sent an email and I requested that this council do what the council 3-4, how long ago was it? Were you on the tour? Okay, so it's been since before 2017 that we did a tour of all the facilities. And we had a checklist of all the things that we saw at each of the facilities, and I would target specifically these 4 facilities because of the concern. I think retention and recruitment have to do with space. We're adding staff, and we have no place to put them. And in addition, they need a work environment that is 2024, ready. I know this is the kind of thing that we tried to Band-Aid along the way, but at some point we just have to say we have to do this. So one of the things that I'd like to know is in the first try on tool, is there a way to look at how to work on different aspects of the 4 facilities over time? Is there a way for it to? Okay.
Yes.
Because I think that's really important, because I don't see that we can talk about recruitment, retention, and staffing without having an appropriate workplace. Just bless all the people who've been here and have put up with what they put up with, not to mention, just some of the mold and mildew issues. So, yeah, I just felt I needed to say that. One other question having to do with the human services. How many, because Community Home Trust has is based on tax money that comes in, how many units does Trust have, and are they building more? Can we expect more, or is that something we have to look at? Because if they're at capacity in what they're going to build in Carrboro, because I know they're building elsewhere, I think they're even building in Durham.
They are.
Right. We need to be looking at what is direct to Carrboro citizens if we're taxing them. And I just don't know what those numbers are, but I'm just asking.
Madam Mayor. Sorry, Randy, I may be able to help with that. Additionally, I'm our rep to Community Home Trust, and so I'm familiar with their budget, their construction plans, and sort of what's driving that. But Brett, please go ahead if you have.
I will take that diversion, Councilmember Frey.
Thanks. So when we recently got the elected officials committee for Community Home Trust together to get an update, the main thing that is driving Community Home Trust's budget is the success that Chapel Hill has been having with their inclusive zoning. My understanding is that Chapel Hill has in excess of 200 units permitted, affordable units, that are going through the program. When I have spoken to staff from Community Home Trust, they're basically saying, listen, we'd love to do stuff in Carrboro, but guess what? Chapel Hill's doing it. Carrboro is, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is me talking about it. Our ordinance is not conducive to actually constructing those units or permitting them, so they don't happen. Now, as a result of that, because the Community Home Trust budget split is based on units, our chunk of their budget is actually getting smaller over time because we have less and less affordable housing. So we should consider it a bad thing when our share goes down for Community Home Trust. My understanding, because of all the growth in Chapel Hill, they're going to add a couple of additional staff members to enable them to sort of handle the increased volume of housing turnover in a way that also may yield some benefits for Carrboro. I believe for the first time they're planning to have a a sort of a rental coordinator who's going to be able to work with the management companies for groups like The Landing, who haven't had a full-time staffer dedicated to working on the relationship with the management company.
Yeah, and I asked that because Brett pointed out what happens in the future. Where's the flexibility for what will come? What possible entity could come? And that's why, I'm looking at the tax and thinking, how do we prepare if we want that tax to be able to go to something else that is more viable and with whatever the new LUO could create. So, for example, and this is just pie in the sky, this is the what if, right? So what if, some entity came along and said, oh yeah, we can do lease to own. And we get very excited about lease to own. What? And so the community wants to, see that happen because, of course, lease to own is intergenerational, right? And rentals are not. So, but we need the flexibility. And so I just raised that because I don't want us to be locked in going forward with a frontier that's ever changing.
Thank you. And then I forgot to say in my prepared remarks, if that's a thing, another consideration for the percentage of the operating budget. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a percentage of the expense or the revenue because it balances. Just to reiterate that. But as the revenues grow, the contributions grow organically with the percentage. So I meant to mention that earlier, and for some reason that triggered that in the back of my brain, whatever you were talking to. So thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Let's see. I had a question about the revenue trend slide. I remember we discussed this briefly at the last working session, but I can tell you've mentioned a couple of times. I know you've been engaging with the School of Government and really digging into the municipal peer environment. I was wondering if you had any policy-related tidbits to share with us related to standards that peers hold for unallocated fund balances. I know, so you talked about, making sure in our next budget that we are sort of coming back down in the general direction of the upper limit of our policy guidance. But I was wondering if you've encountered anything as you're studying, because that policy guidance itself has not been reviewed in some time. I was wondering if you've got any data from peers on that.
Limited, and I'll answer from Brett and not from the town or the staff or any other department. But what I've seen, again, without a deep dive, is more coming up with what's the right number for your town, for your city, and how do you triangulate to that. So Raleigh maintains a 8 to 9% unreserved fund balance as a percent of expenditures. Their budget is $1 billion. 8% of $1 billion is a lot. That can buy fire trucks. 8% of the town of Carrboro's expenditures is not as significant. So that's why prior council triangulated to that 22.5 to 35, which, $6 to $10 million, give or take, feels okay, unless we're renovating everything tomorrow. But that's what I've seen. For a simple answer to probably a pretty loaded question, is that towns see what do they need for their, as we talked about and probably used too loosely, a rainy day fund. What do we need for the unexpected? Because once you go under a certain number, the league steps in and says you need to build this back up, and that really curtails what you're able to invest in operationally. Not to mention the inability to pursue other revenue sources. So again, our recommendation is not even to get into that range yet and tread lightly, but progress towards it, because we also feel like if that unassigned fund balance as a percent of expenditures is growing, that perhaps we're not considering appropriately investing back into the community as effectively as we could. given the revenue sources we have. Is that fair? And we're happy to do some research and more formally come back.
I appreciate that answer. I have a related question around the guidance that you may bring us. So hopefully this is something that can accompany next month's working session package around the suggestions that you make for debt. And historically, Carrboro has been incredibly frugal with operating expenses and has perhaps not utilized debt as efficiently as it should, especially when debt was in the past so cheap. We didn't really touch it. Now debt is expensive. We may have no choice. Just wondering if you have any guidance, or if you get a chance to add some sort of context to that for our package next month. We're really trying to get a sense of, we know that Carrboro is unique and special, but we're also a municipality like every other municipality. And so trying to get some context to those numbers so that we're not looking at only the history of how Carrboro has done things, but to put that in the context of how other municipalities of our size and service level are handling those, adjusting those basic levers for the size of our budget and our ability to meet our citizens' needs.
And to respond, maybe I was a little bit brash when I said debt is expensive. Debt is relatively expensive compared to the last 20 years. We don't have 18.75% mortgages as like we did in the early 80s, right? So debt is still holistically cheap, just not 2.25 cheap, 4.75 cheap. So no opportunity to refinance the little debt that the town has because the town locked in that debt so cheaply. So it's just, it's a consideration. It's more expensive than it has been in the past decade. So, but we can quantify that, and we can see what that burden looks like as an annual cost with ranges, and that's a somewhat simple exercise I think that we could put out there.
I think, Brett, I think what I'm asking for more is not so much how to translate that into an annual. I guess I'm thinking more about when you're bringing us the budget recommendations, which I'm assuming will, maybe not in the next packet, but as we're getting into budget season, it's going to include some recommendations for where we should use debt. Giving some context to that beyond the context of what Carrboro has done in the past for debt, but also sort of bringing in some pure data around this so we can understand what's reasonable for us to do with debt. Carrboro is sort of out of that habit, which is a good thing, but means that that those of us who are on the council sort of haven't been there before.
Thank you. Sure. Makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned before that I'm really glad to pull the thread on, which is holistic. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I'm hoping that you can bring back to us is part of the holistic picture of the, just laying out the landscape with the potential increase in OWASA's costs and stormwater costs and solid waste costs, taxes. I mean, because looking at all of those things independently may look fairly small. But when you talk about a WASA bill that can, if you say to somebody, well, it's going to go up $12, and they go, oh, what's $12? But then you've got $20 for solid waste, and you've got, and it eats away at the affordability. And so one of the key things is with affordability is for the people who are already here who are trying to maintain. And I think we need to be able to, have some document that says we understand what, the death by 1,000 cuts looks like.
Sure. No, I appreciate that point, and we as staff can certainly bring that back next work session. That you hit the nail on the head. It's Duke Energy. It's teens and high teens year-over-year rate increases, not just proposed but adopted.
Yeah.
So, It is all part of the budget process and how we're formulating it, but we can communicate that granularly.
Perfect. Thank you.
I believe we've likely touched on some of these. This is the last content slide that will be formally presented. There are a couple appendix slides just from the league that just give some context around timing, and just to be out there publicly. But main objectives that are short-term goals, stretching into probably the first quarter of next fiscal year for the finance group and for others impacted within the staff of the town, include, certainly not limited to these bullet points, but I'll go bottom up, just to spice things up with a budget presentation. But economic development, and however we can creatively identify other sources of potential revenue to build on, Councilmember Haven O'Donnell's point, even though considering a different space for public use with a small rental fee might be non-impactful on its own. You do that 172 times, maybe that's some significance and helps buy a cruiser. So the staff is heavily invested or heavily vested in considering those options and how to diversify that revenue stream and make that 50 to 60% ad valorem number maybe be 48 to 51%, with some other revenues growing to support the town's needs. Again, the economic development and the delivery of 203 presents some opportunities. Perhaps nothing, again, conservatively building the revenue side of the budget is in place for next fiscal year, but there are opportunities beyond the books to grow that. Again, the review, as previously mentioned, of the whole town fee schedule. Are the fees intended for what are they still purposeful? Are they still serving the needs of the community? Are they equitable? All those considerations, and then are they the right dollars for the finance group? We've talked about the update of the capital improvement program and what goes into that. And what we haven't mentioned publicly right now is addressing the needs of all of the 7 parks. We have a lot of basketball courts that need some repair. I saw Umstead Park in Chapel Hill. The basketball court was closed on Saturday or Sunday for they're painting in certain circles, and it's kind of cool and something I never even thought about, but it looks nice and it looks neat, and we don't have that yet in Carrboro. So there are many of the $5,000 to $50,000 projects that the town could choose to invest in and council could choose to prioritize, but we need to capture that in addition to the heavy lifts of building modernizations.
We also need more basketball courts. I'm just saying. Just putting it out there. Just no, I mean, it's like,
I agree.
Why did the neighborhoods? I mean, it's like every other driveway has basketball courts, and the players, they're playing half court, they're playing horse. They need basketball courts. I'm sorry, just my urban background comes out every now and then, and I just feel like we don't have access to the school gyms. Once upon a time we did. We don't, and it makes a difference. Saying.
Yes. but
I was on a
and not just the courts. It's a signage around the consistency of signage around Anderson Park. I mean, there are, and I don't even mean to just hone in on parks, but that can be other public areas as well. We do have a line item. And then, as we talked about with the financial model, the ARPA funding, is not directly a part of this operating budget presentation, but it is a big time consideration and a communication effort internally among staff, pursuant to the approved programming by the council that's now 2 years old. So that will be coming back to council shortly. We're in the final stages of that. And just to reiterate that timeline, funds need to be not just programmed and obligated and identified, and this is what we're going to do with it. They have to be contracted by the end of this calendar year, so December 31, 2024. Anything that is contracted that falls through after December 21, 2024 cannot be reprogrammed. So there's risk, although the spend sunset is not until December 31st, 2026. So if we're comfortable with an appetite for risk for something that extends beyond calendar year 2024, that's great, but it's a consideration. So we have a list. We have a great list. We have 74 projects identified from ARPA funding. The town will invest that money. We will not give money back to the federal government if at all possible, and we will put it into the community, and we are actively pursuing the best ways to do that with council's prior guidance. And if we need adjustments, because 2 years ago is a long time, that will be represented to council shortly. But we did a quick consent item, as council remembers, in March pertaining to ARPA specifically. There will be an update prior to the summer break with more specifics and more well thought through and numbers associated with the goal. So that's all in the works, and that's another big task the entire town staff and leadership is taking on collectively, being administered by our new grants manager. And again, I included a couple slides from the league, just again for public education, staff, council is aware. We're ahead of the game according to state guidelines, which we should not pat ourselves on the back too heavily, but we're not behind, which is nice. I've heard the term 6:30 said frequently amongst the state. 6:30 is not a date we particularly care about. 7/1 is the date we care about. I know it's a day, but 7/1 is the date we need to adopt. Again, reiterating items we touched on earlier, the 10 days that the budget has to sit and be available for viewing is a critical path item when you're down to 80 days, 74 days, something in that range of days left. 10%'s a lot. And this was not addressing a council concern. This was just a slide from a presentation and a training, and just the capital budgeting, why it's effectively independent from the operating budget. Biggest reason is those investments tend to span more than one fiscal year, and then there are different ways to pay for it, or different revenue options to consider. Maybe not revenue. I don't know if you want to consider taking out a loan revenue. That might lead to some unintended consequences, but ways to pay for the capital investments. So that's the end of the deck, and I'll go back to this slide and answer questions or take notes and follow-ups in any direction council gives.
I think the only thing that I forgot to say, and that it sounded like was forthcoming, but I did just want to reiterate, would love to see, was that brief municipal comparison on the staffing, that 10% number, that comparison. It sounded like you were leaning toward bringing that. I would love to see that. But otherwise for me, I've covered the rest of what I meant to say.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
On that? Is that, how I would answer it would be kind of a subset of peers with a historical look?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, I mean, again, this is speaking strictly as one member. I think that's great. 10% is great. I want to be able to, that's the kind of thing I can anticipate communicating with neighbors about. So I just want to make sure that particularly, I think, you said that some of the investments that our comp set has made since the start of COVID, we invested in 22, they invested again. I would just love Yes. Historical data against the competitive set would be great.
Right, and the rationale, this goes back to private world, private industry versus public, and if there's a consideration there, which there's always considerations everywhere, but it was easy to say we're going to do this increase for staff based on this level of CPI reported. That doesn't work with what we're proposing anymore. I'm not sure. I know the town didn't get there with that argument in its back pocket in prior years, which is why I think the historical is relevant. That makes sense.
Yep.
I'd mentioned just a moment ago similarly some peer context around appropriate levels for debt and for unallocated fund balance. Does anyone feel uncomfortable with that, or is that something that we can consider some guidance from the?
That'd be great.
And I think to Councilman Mulhaven O'Donnell's point, we have made progress into identifying peer group based on size as opposed to just population. So maybe we incorporate some different peers and just some different lenses. And I always like to delete from my inbox so we can over inform and won't be offended if council chooses to delete. So.
And also peers that have a similar profile in terms of revenue potential. Because, as I always say, we love to play with the big dogs, but we don't have their revenue.
Andy, I'm not sure I understand what that means.
Meaning, we play in the same sphere as Chapel Hill and Durham, but we don't have their budget.
Or their revenue potential as we are currently structured.
And that's why when we look at other municipalities of maybe similar size, they may have a data center in their 10-mile radius, and we don't. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Randy, would it be fair to say that you want to make sure we're looking not just at population size, but at sort of, shall we say, revenue mix and maybe service level as sort of guides to who our peers are? Is that a fair way to describe it?
And as I said, revenue potential. In other words, if they already have industry, what does it look like for growth? Because we have yet to explore what our growth potential possibly could be. ESC is making recommendations just now in terms of new directions.
And I will piggyback because you asked the question about the model and its capabilities. Once we define a peer set, we can make unique peer sets. Updating the data is simple. So the hard part's building the list.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions or comment. Under council identified budget priorities, that slide, yes. So I see under long term, and I remember this when we were at the council retreat. I initially had them under short term. Race and equity initiatives and the implementation of the Community Safety Task Force recommendations. And so I guess when I look at those two items and the impact that they have on people and community as far as how we move with those items, I see those items just being implemented all along. Some may start out as low-hanging fruit with the more complex things maybe coming later on. So I guess my question is, since we have race and equity initiatives and community safety task force recommendations, and we have the language access plan, when we say long-term, are we talking about completion or in general? Because in my mind, I feel like we should be making room for those items every budget cycle until we get where we need to be. And some, I mean, may it not ever drop off. I mean, like race and equity initiatives, I mean, that's ongoing. So I want to just kind of understand that from you. And this came from us. I mean, there's no question this came out of our retreat just like this. But, you know, when I was looking over it, I just, you know, kind of thought about it and just said, hey, you know, there's hopefully some items that staff can identify that we can just start doing in the next fiscal year and just continue to move through until we get wherever we need to be or to completion.
I think that's a fair question. I do think that town leadership prior to my involvement has been very proactive in incorporating race and equity into its daily operation. It's very apparent in the budget process, in the budget preparation, and in the budget book. Each department directly addressing considerations. Certainly, it's involved with every agenda item that we put forth to council. This slide from the retreat, I do think merits. We've done a lot already to address what were identified as long-term goals in the short term. You know, the first iteration of the language access plan is adopted. So that's not next fiscal year, that's this month. You know, we have a plan in place to fund the implementation of the Community Safety Task Force. So those two specific items are really short-term accomplishments. But I think, as we mentioned, I believe we mentioned it in the modeling work session, we have identified dollars in the next fiscal year budget associated with race and equity programming. And what does that mean? We're not sure what that directly means yet, whether it's staff training, whether it's you know, involvement with the community, you know, whatever channel that takes, we don't know, but we know that, you know, we've devoted a department, you know, to lead those efforts, and we're, you know, hopefully incorporating those. We're not deferring that into the long term and tackling that on a daily basis would be how I would answer that.
Okay, so true. Community Safety Task Force recommendation. This council had a work session, and if I'm remembering correctly, we were aligning with all of those recommendations. And so, you know, the task force, of course, is waiting for us to decide how we're going to implement those recommendations. I have no idea how much money. I don't know what the budget is, you know, for those items, you know, but certainly seeing movement there would be good. And that's why I said I'm not sure what you mean when we say long term. It's like what does that even mean, right? So short term staff retention recruitment, we know we're gonna pop off with that, right? Short term. So long term, what do we mean? Like what are we talking about outside of what we're doing or have done already?
Sure. I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
It might defer to
okay.
more discussion.
Yeah.
And the first part of the question is we have, and this will be more formally presented to council as part of the ARPA presentation, but it's $75,000 associated with the implementation of the Safety Task Force right now. 75.
Okay.
What's not on this list is the Family Financial Assistance Program. And the potential reinvestment into that into a next phase due to the reception that has received from the town and the need, you know, as evident throughout the community. I don't know how to answer what the long-term objectives would be, other than that we incorporate it into our daily, you know, 9 to 5 as part of all of our considerations and decision-making process.
Okay.
I mean, just
Go
maybe.
ahead, Jason.
Well, yeah,
Thank
maybe
you,
just
Brett.
kind of a distinction. Is it long term? It kind of, in how you're describing it, long term is kind of, I'm hearing it as ongoing, as opposed to like we're not putting this off, but this is something that's not going to be done this year. Like the LUO rewrite, we hope will be done.
Started.
It'll be started and finished very soon. Whereas we have started these longer term projects, but they're going to continue for the extent of the foreseeable future. I mean, rather than deferring them. Is that kind of, that makes sense? Is that that's what I hear you saying anyway.
That sounds well said. Yeah, okay. All right.
And I'm gonna jump on that one, yeah.
Yes.
No problem.
Very agreeable.
No problem, thank you.
But I don't want to discount what leadership and town staff has already put into incorporating that, in the immediate, so, and building upon that.
And if we could go to the primary budget consideration slide. So we know that $0.015 on, our taxes are already going to the Affordable Housing Special Revenue Fund. So that is now, and that's what it has been. So I see where it says convert to a 2% of operating budget to fund Affordable Housing Special Revenue Fund annually. So what, can you give a rough estimate of that? Like what you think that may be?
Dollars,
Like just say it's
600.
today.
600 is effectively the 2%.
$600,000.
Yes.
I think I like that. Okay.
In
'Cause
addition,
right now,
to the $0.015.
Oh, I think I love that. Okay.
And
In
growing as
addition.
our revenue grows.
Yeah, I think I love that. Those are my only two. I didn't have anything else. Thank you. That was it for me. Mm-hmm. Nobody? Okay. Thank you, Brett. You have anything else for us? See you next month.
Maybe next week.
Next week, we'll be ready.
Hopefully next week. We'll have
Tis the
something.
season.
I appreciate the time, and again, I want to thank the town leadership and the staff for the work that they've done in allowing me to present where we are today. And it's a good story, and we'll get a little more granular next month, and we'll adopt it and we'll move forward. But it's been fun and exciting to be a part of it, and I appreciate the council's time this evening and consideration and direction, most importantly.
Yeah.
You're up to your ears in historical budgets, so thank you for the hard work.
Exactly. So thank you. We appreciate you. It was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Nobody else?
Shout out to Eleazar. I move we adjourn.
You know what? You didn't do it quick enough. Motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Just a second.
I'll second.
All right. All in favor to adjourn, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned.